The film starts in an area of outer space called the Aegis system. We see a powered-down spaceship called the Obanon. Asteroids and mangled bodies float around it, indicating that something gruesome has taken place. A smaller spaceship approaches and lands on top of the Obanon. 5 space marines enter the large ship and communicate with their main ship that they have arrived inside the main service corridor. When they turn on their night vision, the space marines see bodies everywhere. They notice that the bodies are torn apart as if attacked by a beast. One of them pulls up their holographic console and shows the team that there are 4 survivors out of 100 crew. Suddenly, the engine starts to activate, causing the ship to move and spin for a significant distance before stopping. Inside the engine room, we see our 4 main characters. Dr. Isabel Cho, a scientist named Nolan Strauss, a space engineer Alejandro Borges, and a soldier named Nicholas Kuttner all begin arguing. They heard a sound coming from behind them. The door busts open, and the 5 Marines enter the engine room, pointing their guns at the group. Isabel attempts to introduce herself to the armed men, but Nicholas points a gun at them instead. The group tries to stop Nicholas, but he accidentally fires a shot, taking down one of the Marines. The soldiers proceed to electrocute the 4 survivors. The Space Marines bring the survivors to their spaceship. When they leave the Obanon, they make sure to blow it up before moving on. Back in the Marine spaceship, the 4 remaining soldiers gossip about their mission. They come across 2 interrogators. Meanwhile, in a separate room, the head of the interrogation team speaks with his superior. He is given the order to use enhanced interrogation methods on the 4 survivors. The mission must be completed in 7 hours, which is the time it takes for the ship to reach its destination. The 2 interrogators arrive at the room, and the head tells them to bring in the first survivor. Inside a containment cell, the 4 survivors can barely keep it together. Alejandro is raising his voice out of frustration. Nolan is mumbling about something, while Nicholas is talking to a hallucination of his daughter. Only Isabel is quiet. Alejandro tries to pick a fight with Nicholas, but Isabel tells him to calm down. Isabel points out that they are aboard a government interceptor spaceship. She explains further that the government might be looking for people to blame for the incident on the Obanon, and it might be them. The door opens, and 3 soldiers step in. They ask Nicholas to come with them, but he puts up a fight. The guards eventually drag him out of the cell after electrocuting and beating him up. While being dragged, we see Nicholas's first-person view and his hallucinations of his daughter. He arrives at the interrogation room, and the soldiers strap him tightly on a chair. Nicholas struggles and refuses to cooperate. The interrogators activate a device that simulates someone's biggest fear. They make Nicholas experience the realistic feeling of being burnt alive. After ending the simulation, they ask him his name and occupation. Then, they make him tell them everything that happened back at the Obanon. Nicholas, not wanting to get burnt again, cooperates. Nicholas begins narrating the details of a classified mission he was on. A flashback begins and shows a scene inside a meeting room. Nicholas is looking at a picture of his deceased daughter. Nolan tries to strike up a conversation with him, but he responds rudely. Isabel tells the scientist not to disturb Nicholas because he is grieving the loss of his daughter. One by one, other people sit at the meeting table and begin making small talk. Commander Sergenko arrives and prepares to begin the briefing. Alejandro tries to ask for more information, but Sergenko responds with vague answers. The captain of the ship enters the room and begins explaining the mission. The team is expected to land on Aegis 7, a planet that was mostly destroyed due to a mining accident. The mission involves stabilizing the gravity of the planet to hold it together. Most of the people at the table react negatively, knowing that such a task is impossible. The captain explains further that 8 stabilizers will be deployed at key locations. Alejandro questions the validity of the mission, but the captain insists that the people can't back out because they've signed up for the mission. The captain ends the meeting but asks 4 people, namely Nolan, Nicholas, Isabel, and Rin, to remain. The captain reveals that an alien artifact has landed on the planet. He explains that the mission of the 4 people there is to retrieve fragments of that artifact on Aegis 7. The captain also reveals that the artifact fragments are sold at 2 million credits per kilo. While preparing to land on the planet, Alejandro asks the other members what their tasks are since the other members are not engineers. Nolan lies, stating that they are there to conduct a gravity survey. Alejandro doesn't believe him, given the state of the planet. After a short while, the crew deploys a stabilizer and lands on the planet. They witness a planet covered in broken terrain and pools of lava. The engineers head to the stabilizer's landing area while the rest of the crew begin the real mission. Nicholas almost gets hit by spurting lava. He is barely able to communicate with Rin as the signal becomes unstable. After walking some more, he stumbles upon an artifact fragment. Nicholas grabs the fragment, but he suddenly hears voices. He falls to his knees, and he starts seeing hallucinations of his deceased daughter. Nicholas experiences emotional distress after seeing his daughter's accident replay in front of him. Rin calls Nicholas and tells him to rejoin the others. On his way there, he sees another hallucination of his daughter, but this time accompanied by a shadow monster. However, Nicholas snaps out of the hallucination and realizes that it is Rin in front of him, not a monster. When Nicholas convenes with the other crew members, he sees them as monsters. Sajenka and the others become confused by Nicholas's behavior. Suddenly, Nicholas sees the illusion of her daughter again, this time near the engineers working at the stabilizer. He rushes towards the stabilizer and attacks the engineers. While fighting with the engineers, he accidentally strikes the control panel, making the stabilizer non-functional. When Nicholas snaps out of his trance, he sees Alejandro screaming, holding the lifeless Noah in his arms. Nicholas tries approaching him, unaware of what transpired. Alejandro knocks Nicholas back a few feet. Sergenko arrives and takes the artifact fragment from Nicholas's hand, placing it in a container. Then he gives the order to detain him. Back to the present, Nicholas screams after finishing his story. The interrogators deliver an electric shock to calm him down. As soon as his restraints are released, Nicholas fights everyone in the room. He manages to steal a gun from one of the guards and escape the interrogation room. He continues down the hall and takes out 2 guards while getting shot as well. Then, he sees the illusion of his daughter again near the escape hatch and follows it. Nicholas falls down with blood flowing out from his chest. The illusion of his daughter motivates him to stand up and press the button to open the airlock. Several soldiers follow behind him, but they are too late. Nicholas opens the airlock, sending him and the ones behind him into outer space. The head interrogator sees Nicholas floating in space. Since they lost someone who came in direct contact with the shard, he believes their superior will not be pleased. The head interrogator then orders his subordinate to bring Alejandro Borges into the interrogation room. Back at the holding cell, Alejandro gets increasingly annoyed by Nolan. The scientist mentions that he can feel that Nicholas has passed away. Shortly after, 3 soldiers enter the room to escort Alejandro. The scene shifts to the interrogation chamber. Multiple spiders are crawling on Alejandro's face and body, causing him to scream. The interrogator asks him if he is ready to answer questions. He complies with the request and begins telling them his version of the past event. He tells them that he didn't know the shard existed in the first place. Alejandro's flashback starts on Aegis 7. He and the other engineers fix a stabilizer that is malfunctioning. His cousin, Noah, manages to prevent the stabilizer from overloading. One of the engineers, Omar, asks Alejandro why he has a mechanical arm. Noah reveals that Alejandro had saved people from a terrible work accident in the past. Omar shares that he once tried to become a priest. The others mock him for his belief, but he doesn't let their mockery affect him. During their conversation, the stabilizer becomes unstable again. Just like in the previous flashback, Nicholas enters their work area and starts assaulting them. In this version, we clearly see Noah doing his best to fix the stabilizer while Alejandro fends off Nicholas's attacks. Unfortunately, as soon as Noah fixes the stabilizer, he gets hit in the head by Nicholas. Isabel tries to save Noah, but it's too late, the damage is fatal. The stabilizer erupts into flames, and everyone runs towards their shuttle. Commander Sergenko carries the container while evading the bursting flames in his surroundings. The group encounters a chasm ahead of them. Rin and Nolan jump, but the latter almost falls off. Rin saves him, but she falls into the chasm instead. Everyone clears the jump, but the gap widens before Sergenko attempts to leap. The commander throws the container toward the group and tells them to go ahead and leave him behind. Omar also loses his life to a falling boulder shortly after. The remaining crew members arrive at their shuttle. Since the commander is gone, Alejandro pilots the shuttle, despite having limited capabilities to operate it. As the planet erupts, multiple shuttles from various teams escape and head toward the Obanon. Some of them get hit by debris. Alejandro and the others observe the mothership preparing to leave since it is too close to the dying planet. Alejandro tries his best to make the shuttle faster, as he and his crewmates don't want to get left behind. Eventually, they manage to crash land into the docking bay, at the cost of damaging the shuttle and setting the runway aflame. Alejandro approaches the captain of the Obanon and tries to confront him. However, the captain makes him wait due to an emergency. Aegis 7 explodes, and the massive shockwave closes in on the ship at an alarming speed. The crew prepares to activate a shock point drive that would propel the Obanon at light speed. However, before they can activate it, the shockwave reaches them, heavily damaging the ship. The blast injures and incapacitates several crew members. The captain orders everyone to make the Obanon ride the wave instead. The captain orders Alejandro to go to the engine room and repair the shock point drive. However, the engineer refuses to follow and demands the captain to explain why a piece of rock was worth his cousin's life. Isabel tells the captain what happened on the planet. The captain responds by taking Alejandro, Nolan, and Isabel to a separate room. The captain tells them that the artifact is worth a lot of money because it may lead to the next scientific breakthrough. Alejandro doesn't seem convinced and becomes more agitated. He ends up punching the captain. The captain doesn't punish Alejandro for his actions because he still needs him to repair the engine. He orders Alejandro to repair the O'Bannon's engines, otherwise, everyone on the ship will perish. The flashback ends, and we return to the scene at the interrogation chamber. The head interrogator asks Alejandro if he ever had direct contact with the fragment. The engineer reiterates that he did not touch it. A lie detector indicates that he is being truthful, and he is released from his restraints. The interrogators tell him that he'll be escorted to the guest quarters and is free to go after some medical exams. Alejandro excitedly converses with the soldiers escorting him. Unfortunately, one of them shoots him from the back of his head. The interrogator orders the soldiers to take Alejandro's body to a cold storage unit and asks them to bring in Nolan Strauss. The scene shifts back to the interrogation room, where Nolan is being placed inside a coffin. In reality, he is experiencing a simulation to induce his claustrophobia. After the simulation ends, the head interrogator exposes Nolan's true identity as a secret investigator of alien markers. Nolan corroborates the interrogator's claims and begins telling him his version of the events following the destruction of Aegis 7. The flashback starts at Nolan's quarters. He has a conversation with his wife, who asks him about the details of his work. She brings up Nolan's co-worker Isabel because he suspects that he's having an affair. Nolan dodges the question and gives stingy answers, then leaves. Nolan enters the captain's quarters and sees him drinking. He asks for the fragment to be placed in his care. The captain expresses his frustration about why his scientist is privy to more information about the fragment than him. Nolan doesn't argue but instead points out that the captain looks unwell. The captain reveals that the fragment is making him hear voices. After that, he tells Nolan to get the shard out of his sight. Back at Nolan's laboratory, he begins inspecting the fragment. He becomes astonished by the code written on it. Suddenly, his brain becomes flooded with information concerning the item in front of him, to the point that it makes his head hurt. Nolan's assistant asks if he is okay, but he dismisses her query. Nolan starts writing alien code on his holographic screen. Isabel arrives at the lab and asks Nolan what he is doing. Nolan makes the other assistant leave. He tells Isabel all about his discovery involving the new alien language and its secrets. Isabel comes closer, inspecting Nolan's face, wondering why he seems tense. Nolan continues to drone on about the fragment, but Isabel stops him by giving him a kiss. Isabel nudges Nolan and pushes him down while stripping. She initiates an affair before the scene changes. A few hours later, Nolan explains the fragment's properties to the captain. He tells him that the fragment is capable of reanimating dead tissue and turning it into a new form. The captain asks Nolan what happened to Nicholas. Nolan explains that some people will enter hyperpsychosis when they come in contact with the fragment. Furthermore, Nolan theorizes that the fragment was made by a higher life form, similar to a god. The captain laughs at his theory and tells him to get more sleep. Nolan goes back to his laboratory and inspects the fragment further. He starts seeing nightmares, but he ignores them. He convinces himself that the knowledge gained from the shard is worth having hallucinations for. He brings a corpse to his lab and exposes it to the shard. The power suddenly goes out for a second. When it returns, the corpse is no longer at the table. Nolan opens the container to look for it, but he experiences a hallucination shortly after. When he snaps out of it, the body is still missing. Then he sees a zombie in front of him. Nolan tries to run, but he bumps into his assistant. The zombie attacks the assistant instead. Inside the O'Bannon's morgue, one of the corpses opens its eyes. Meanwhile, in another part of the ship, Nolan runs away from the reanimated corpse, or necromorph, that's chasing him. He stumbles into a corridor where two technicians are repairing something. Nolan hides inside a ventilation chamber. The necromorph arrives and attacks the first thing it sees, which are the technicians. Nolan continues to run until he finds a communication console. He tries calling the captain's attention, but the captain is too busy talking with Alejandro. The captain's talk with Alejandro gets interrupted when a group of necromorphs attack the engine room. The captain cuts off communication with Nolan before he can explain anything. The alarm systems in the O'Bannon go off, and the whole ship is in a state of emergency. Nolan goes back to his quarters to make sure his family is safe. He calls for his wife and approaches his son's crib. He sees a monster jump at him, and he immediately strikes it down with his weapon. Another monster appears behind Nolan, screaming. Without hesitation, he bludgeons it until it's no longer moving. Unbeknownst to Nolan, he was hallucinating, and what he actually murdered was his son and wife. Isabel enters his quarters and sees what he did. The flashback ends, and Nolan continues talking about the monsters that attacked his family. The interrogator asks him where his family is. He tells them that they are inside his quarters, but the interrogator knows that it's not the case. They ask him the same question, and he gives the same answer. The lie detector shows that Nolan believes he is being truthful. The interrogators try administering electric shocks to get Nolan to confess his crime, but the scientist never relents. Nolan asks the interrogators if he, too, will be disposed of. The interrogators reassure him that he will keep living because he was in direct contact with the fragment. An assistant enters the room, bringing with him a coffin-like container. They place Nolan inside and drag the container out of the room. After that, the head interrogator asks for Isabel Cho to be brought inside. In the next scene, we hear Isabel scream in agony. The interrogator asks her about the effects of the shard on the crew. She tells him that he is asking the wrong person. The interrogator repeats himself, pointing out that Isabel had an affair with Nolan. He then threatens to torture Isabel if she doesn't answer. Isabel complies and begins telling her version of the events at the O'Bannon. The flashback starts as Isabel describes her affair with Nolan. She explains that it just happened after working together for a year. Their liaison lasted for months until the day that Nolan became affected by the shard. One night, Isabel asks Nolan to come to the sick bay with her so she can run some medical scans on him. Nolan becomes agitated by the suggestion and asks Isabel to leave. Isabel checks on Nicholas's condition in the sick bay. He asks him how he's feeling and if he's still seeing his daughter. Nicholas insists that his daughter is out playing and that she'll come back soon. He also mentions that he needs to get his daughter back home soon. Lastly, before Isabel leaves, he talks about seeing monsters every time he closes his eyes. Isabel talks to the other medical personnel about their next task. When they enter the morgue, they see all the corpses are no longer there. They also see the body of one of the doctors, mangled and sprawled on the floor. Suddenly, the doctor's body transforms into a necromorph and chases Isabel. Fortunately, he escapes as her colleagues close the door behind her, trapping the necromorph. Isabel tries to hide in the sick bay where Nicholas is. A necromorph slams itself on the door, trying to bust it open. Nicholas asks Isabel to remove his restraints so he can fight. She complies just as the necromorph breaks inside. Nicholas successfully defeats the necromorph. He tells Isabel that the shard is the source of the commotion. Isabel and Nicholas explore the O'Bannon to look for survivors. They encounter the chief of the Marines, who tries to attack them. However, the chief suddenly gets grabbed by tentacles, allowing Isabel and Nicholas to escape. Isabel arrives outside Nolan's quarters. She encounters Nolan and sees the bodies of his family lying on the floor. She panics and tells him to back away. Nolan, on the other hand, is unaware of why Isabel is acting that way. Outside of Nolan's quarters, the captain of the ship and his trusted officers fight against a giant necromorph. The captain sees Nolan, and asks him what's going on. The scientist gives a vague and unhelpful answer. Meanwhile, more necromorph appear, outnumbering the survivors. Nicholas sees the illusion of her daughter and follows it. Isabel tells the group that Nicholas is heading in a direction that will allow them to shake off the monsters. The captain gives the order to run away and follow Nicholas. The group head inside a tunnel. While fleeing the scene, one of the officers gets snagged by a necromorph. The captain screams in distress, but Isabel tells him they must move forward. The group ends up inside Nolan's lab. They come across Alejandro, who immediately chokes Nicholas upon seeing him. The captain breaks them up and asks Alejandro if he was able to repair the shock point drive. The engineer admits that the engine room is decimated, and that he and the other crew members barely survived the attack. When the captain asks Nolan about the situation, the scientist starts talking about higher forms of life and convergence. Another person in the room verifies his claims. Isabel asks Nolan how to get rid of the monster. He tells the group that the signal from the shard must be stopped if they want to get rid of the necromorphs. Nicholas tries to shoot the fragment, but it barely makes any dent. Nolan points out that it can't be easily destroyed. Alejandro suggests throwing it into a reactor core, and Nolan confirms that it might do the job. The captain then orders everyone to move to the engine room. Alejandro tries to protest, but Nicholas says that they'll fight their way inside. After arming themselves with improvised weapons, the group heads to the engine room. The group fights their way through a horde of necromorphs. When they finally reach the engine room, an asteroid hits the side of the ship and creates a large hole. Most of the necromorphs get sucked into the hole, and thrown into outer space. Meanwhile, the survivors try their best not to get pulled in by the breach. One survivor gets pounced on by a necromorph and dragged into the breach. Nicholas almost falls off if not for Alejandro and Isabel's intervention. Nolan tries to power up the ship's engine but encounters a problem. The switch to close the door is outside the room and in a dangerous spot. Someone has to go out because the switch inside is broken. The captain volunteers to be that person. He issues a final order and sacrifices himself just to close the door to the engine room. Nolan, Isabel, Nicholas, and Alejandro enter the room where the shock point drive is located. They get ambushed by more necromorphs, and almost get overwhelmed. Nolan manages to grab the shard container, but he suddenly stops moving. Everyone shouts at him to throw the shard into the reactor, but he ignores them. Isabel eventually approaches him, punches his face, and throws the container into the reactor. Multiple red lightning bolts fly out of the reactor, making all of the necromorphs explode. The flashback ends, and Isabel tells the interrogator that he knows the next part of the story. She soon finds out that the interrogators know about the shard's capabilities and that she and her crewmates were expected to come in contact with it. A distinguished old gentleman enters the room and introduces himself as the overseer. He apologizes to Isabel and explains the goal of the government to her, which is to change the face of humanity. He then escorts Isabel out of the interrogation room. When he leaves, one of the soldiers locks the room and discreetly executes the interrogators. The overseer elaborates further on the government's goals to use the marker to enhance human life. He also asks Isabel to cooperate with them in making a cover story to hide the incident at the O'Bannon. She strongly refuses, stating that the government is playing God with human life. Isabel is then forcibly strapped into an operating table. A machine then drills a hole in her head. After some time, a news story is broadcasted to several space stations. The news reports state that Isabel Cho is a terrorist responsible for destroying the O'Bannon. As the cover story spreads, the overseer and his colleagues watch the screen in satisfaction. They then order the staff to bring Nolan's cryo-cell container into the room, and place him alongside the other container. The camera zooms into Nolan's name, and it pans to another name, another person who came in contact with the fragment.